listeners. Welcome back to the Corrective Culture podcast. Today we have Brent Brookbush from the Brookbush Institute. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good.
Yeah, we'll before we were introducing, we're like, you got to say your name 10 times fast to get it out.
Don't try. It's not worth it. I don't even know why you're doing that to people.
It's like a full tongue twister, right?
Yeah, Brent.
Totally.
Brookbush.
Yeah, Brent,
What people don't know is that's actually the final exam for our certification. That's all that is.
And so we just had to get you on because for a long time, I've told people, I've actually directed a lot of people to your work because for me, it's really cool to find someone that's so passionate at teaching and really just such a good teacher at, I've said it before, but finding the simplicity amongst the complexity. And yeah. I just find like even just the very first videos I saw of yours were just teaching anatomy, right? But the way you taught it is you're teaching like a language. You're not teaching remember this to that. And that language is so empowering for the upcoming student, no matter what modality you're in, whether you're a PT, chiro, physio, whatever it is, it's so empowering because I think people get lost at the start thinking, I got to remember where this goes and that goes and what is the joint actions and things like that. But the way you explained it was just conceptual. And I think that's what all the best teachers do. And it really has personally helped. We're both members of the Institute. We both are subscribed. And it's just helped so much.
Oh yeah, a lot of the anatomy stuff that I've learned through you.
Yeah,
because it's just the way you explain it, so simple and so, like Callan said, conceptual, and it makes so much sense. So for us, you know, always wanting to know more, it was just so helpful.
Yeah, and just some small little details of just like, oh, that's gold. And it's cool hearing because as you know, we both do checks, so we do a lot of goniometry assessment and stuff. But it's cool hearing people come up with similar conclusions from clinical experience. And that's what I think is unique in the industry and unique with yourself is that a lot of the stuff you can speak on like, oh, this is like when this happens, generally people will do this. And that's the little details that you want. Because I think we're in a modality of like definitely evidence-based things, but a lot of the evidence isn't out there for a lot of things. But in the field, if it's not on a piece of paper, it doesn't exist. But then you get clinicians that saying, oh, no, this, you know, from experience, I've seen this go on, and it makes sense logical. But if there's not a study attached to it, it doesn't exist. And it's sort of, I think it leaves people behind from pioneering and trying new things because they're waiting for someone else to figure it out before them. So,
I mean, there's a few points in there.
Yeah.
You definitely bring up some good stuff. I mean, I think a lot of people don't know that the Brookbush Institute was actually started with the idea that I was going to optimize delivery. Right. So when you guys bring up the functional anatomy lectures and how those are explained in a different way, it definitely warms my heart to hear that because that was the intent, right? Like the intent was not just to be like, oh, I'll be another anatomy teacher. Yeah. Great. Because that's what we needed more of, right? I was like, we have some smart people in our industry, but for the most part, we have pretty poor teachers. Like most of these people do not have education in education. They wouldn't know how to write a study plan. They don't understand that you need multiple ways of communicating and explaining ideas, and that if you were going to base education on things like comprehension and retention and application, most educators wouldn't fare very well in our industry. So that's kind of what started the Brookbush Institute now more than 10 years ago. But then you guys kind of bring up this other point of like, you have the clinical gems that come with experience and, you know, you got to put stuff into practice. And I think we see, especially on social media, I can tell when somebody's throwing out an idea, but they haven't tested it. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? You're going, yeah, that's not going to work very well because, you know, your clients aren't all super experienced personal trainers who kind of understand how to do that complex thing. And once you get that into a home exercise program, it's going to fall apart. Fully. You can tell they haven't put it into practice. And you talked about that evidence-based piece, and you brought up a couple of great points there where it's like, number one, when you see somebody talk about a piece of research or they want to talk about being evidence-based, and they say something that is totally counter to clinical experience, they're usually wrong. Usually what they've done is they've cherry-picked a study, and when you take one study it's like taking one nail out of that wall behind you. It doesn't tell you anything about the wall. It just tells you about what happened to this one nail and this one piece of wood. And sure, it's part of the overall construct. Like, we have to figure out how that piece of data fits. But it is interesting. As you know, we do these huge reviews to start every course, right? Everything is based on all of the research that's available. And one thing I've said to many people over the years is, like, it's funny how when you look at all of the research, it actually starts to just match what you see in practice.
Yeah.
Fully.
It's pretty rare that you see something just like totally take people off in a random direction. We all, generally speaking, except for the most lazy and contradictory of us, want to see people get better. So when you keep testing stuff in practice, which is an informal way of running an experiment, which is a lot of times what research is, right? They should kind of join up. Now, we get some weird nuances, like, for example, when we were doing our rest between sets course, I think everybody was already leaning towards longer rest between sets is probably a better idea. If we're talking about, like, bench press rest, not circuit training, but like, kind of the conventional style of training. We were kind of all leaning in the direction that longer rest was better, but then we kind of found this like interesting thing where maybe rest between sets should be based on the number of sets you're going to do per exercise. It's almost like cumulative. The more sets you're going to do, the longer rest you need between sets. That's a weird nuance that maybe we wouldn't have found without the research. But on the same token, that is not totally counter what we see in clinic, right?
Yeah.
Now, when I hear people say stuff like manual therapy doesn't work, that's where I go, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
You need to read. And, like, you're obviously not looking at all of the evidence. You're cherry picking something like, okay, yeah, if somebody has a lumbar instability and you go and do a lumbar mobilization on them, it's probably not going to have a great effect. Yeah. I kind of expected that, but you got to read the rest of the research to find out when something like a lumbar mobilization is appropriate, right?
Wow, man.
Anyway, sorry.
That's good.
3 points to just picked out of what you just started.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
You got a smart brain, you can tell.
Yeah.
It retains information.
It's cool because
it doesn't stop.
Because I think the base, like when I think about it, is just basic physics and engineering and compression and tension and sort of seeing that. It's funny because I used to be a scaffolder back in the day. So that was really looking at, and I used to do sort of more advanced ones. So it was really looking at where tension and compression is and then having to brace it. And I sort of think similar with the body of like, okay, that's under tension, that's under compression. How can I use the body to contract this and lengthen that and start playing really? And that's what a lot of the stuff I do is I just played with my own body even a lot and see. But how we're talking about evidence-based, like, you'll see research saying how stretching doesn't change performance or doesn't reduce injury risk and things like that, right? But then obviously if it's a bunch of random stretching, you're going to see random results all the time. And even like we'll get people come at us that are like against the foam roller. It's like a religion to them. They're just so against it. But that's when I see, okay, this person hasn't done clinical experience because, man, like you can get someone with a bit of a shoulder impingement going on and release a bit of the rear capsule and all of a sudden, even short term, it feels free, but then it gives you a window of opportunity to do your exercise. But that's so many areas in the body. I've seen that. I've seen where a bit of tissue work can really take their pain away and then they can do movement. So it's like using the two together. And that's what I think about clinical experience and also just fascia, right? Thinking about stickiness and how it could dry out. So what's your answer? Because I saw actually a thing from Bio Lane the other day talking about how stretching doesn't change injury rates. What's your stance on that? And yeah, what's your opinion on that?
You need to read more research if that's what you think. Like, Lane Norton, for example, is a nutritionist. He's not a rehab professional. So why he's talking about injury rates, I'm not really sure. But if he were to read all of the research on stretching, you start to realize that general stretching is not going to change your injury rates. General stretching is generally not going to change your performance. but I don't know why you'd be doing general stretching anyway, right? Like, what happened to assessment, right? Like this is a piece that I think I see a lot of people scared of, right? Is where they go, I'm going to try to come up with the simple solution, the simple answer of why I'm not going to use this technique, rather than going, wait a second, this technique is one tool. What was my use of this tool based on? And what was the outcome I was trying to get? Right? Like you were talking about scaffolding. Like if you had a bunch of screws, why did you grab a hammer, bro? Like, you know, what's going on here? So with stretching, it's interesting. You see that stretching is one of the most effective techniques for improving flexibility. Okay. But you have to be careful. You can't put the two things together that, well, does that mean improving flexibility doesn't reduce your chance of getting injured? You're still missing one piece. Are we stretching things that needed to be stretched, as in we assessed them as having a loss of extensibility or a loss of range of motion? If we have a loss of range of motion and now we use stretching to bring somebody back to optimal range of motion, we then see decreases in the risk of injury, and we see an increase in performance, right? So there's this missing piece again. And of course, what has happened in the very example, which I've heard before, not just from Lane, but from other individuals, right? I've heard from more that stretching isn't necessary, or foam rolling isn't necessary. Yeah, man, you found one study that showed this general application based on this one thing didn't get the outcome that was measured. That doesn't mean that the thing that you're talking about doesn't have a use based on a different assessment. And if we had looked at a different outcome measure, we would have seen something different. For example, with foam rolling, now you're not talking about stretching muscles. You're talking about increasing or decreasing activity, right? We have that whole concept of tone or concept of trigger points and how trigger points create acute points of hyperactivity within a muscle, right? Around the motor end plate. Is foam rolling effective for reducing overactivity in a muscle that has been assessed as overactive based on movement assessment? The answer to that question is yeah. Right? But like, okay, so foam rolling doesn't, I don't know, whatever they measure. It doesn't reduce pain in a low back patient. Nobody ever suggested you should just roll things that hurt. Like that's not it's not generally a great way to go about doing things, you know? So it's interesting because what's happening right now is really frustrating. You know, you see social media is really negative, right? Like it's always negative. The trolls win all the time. And unfortunately, even if you're running like an education company like I am, or maybe offering some other product like Lane Norton is or whatever, you get baited into being negative because of the way human nature is. Negative information travels 6 times faster than, or 6 times more than normal information. Of course, at the end of the day, I still have to fund this education company. I still need to generate revenue. I still have to pay my employees. So I get baited into saying something negative so that I can get the attention I need to get my cost of acquisition down, so that I can get the profit margins I need to hire my next employee, right? Like it all becomes this big, horrible thing, right? And so negativity just keeps getting pumped and pumped and pumped and pumped and pumped. And it's almost like in vogue, even when you don't run a business, to just come out against stuff, right? Like it's just controversy for clicks.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to say something negative. It's like, yeah, if you don't have anything, you know, we posted something the other day, which is controversial unto itself, but I basically threw this out there. If you're an educator that said something was ineffective, doesn't work, shouldn't be used, is effing stupid, and you don't replace it with another effective technique, you're an irresponsible, horrible educator, period. Because if all you do is take things away from people, you're not making them better.
Yeah.
Right? Like, okay, you can't foam roll and you can't stretch. what are you supposed to do when somebody comes in and they have an obvious loss of range of motion?
Yeah, they're just uneducated, aren't they? And one of the first things is like your assessment tools are very, very similar to what we kind of learnt from Czech, don't you reckon? Like,
yeah, well, it's just it's conceptual. So I love about it. It makes sense and it's logic.
It makes sense.
And it makes you think.
But where else do you see that in the world? You know what I mean?
That's
like,
why. Yeah, also,
it's rare.
There's actually, I think. Do you know Matthew Walden at all? Not sure if you know Matthew Walden.
Name sounds familiar.
He follows you. You
have to apologize. Like, if I don't know somebody, like, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
All I do is run this company. Yeah. So, like, that's already beyond a full-time job.
What, you don't know the whole industry?
No.
Yeah, well, actually, he started following you, and that's how I found your page. And he's actually the head of Czech Education, and originally an osteo, and he was a naturopath, and a few other things. But and I was like, oh man, they're so similar, like in the way that the conceptual truths come behind it, and talking about all the same stuff, and it was cool.
There's a history there, right?
Yeah.
The history that, like, you know, Paul Chek, if I recall, was self-educated, but he read a lot.
Yeah.
You know, and like he's still coming out of the same, you know, Kendall, Yonda, Lewitt, like Mike Clark over at who created the OPT model. They're all coming out of this same school of thought, right? And it's just that alone is an important concept, right? Like, this is not the first intelligent generation. I tell kids this all the time.
Yeah.
You are not the first intelligent person to graduate from school.
Yeah.
Right? If you're looking at somebody like Yonda and going, bullshit. That was a physician with 50 years of experience writing, researching, and educating, and you think you as a new grad are smarter than he ever was?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, man.
So you look at the similarities between a lot of these guys, like obviously us and Paul Chek to a certain point, and NASM when they were under Mike Clark, and even other guys like Leon Chaital. Like, I mean, we can keep going on all of these different names and pull all these different people.
Yeah.
But they all have this tendency to have pulled from history, pulled from all of these great professionals that we've been learning from for at least 70 years. At least. And probably more like 100 to 140 years. You know, you go back to like Syriacs, and I mean, history.
Where did your story, man? I'm so curious. Like, how did your story begin in getting into the rehab field and the movement field in general? Like, how did your story begin? And where did your education? Did it come from just being curious and looking into something, or did it come from just life and wanting to learn about that? Like, how did you learn what you learned, and how did that begin?
Wow. Okay. I have a pretty weird history, actually. I went to a performing arts academy in school. I was kind of like this, like, young prodigy trombone player. Like, I was a jazz trombone player.
That's so sick.
Ended up on a full tuition ride to play jazz in New York, which is where I'm at now.
Yeah.
I tore this muscle in my face. You could actually kind of see some of the scar tissue there from a couple surgeries I had. Every once in a while, somebody will ask me, like, do you do dip or chew or whatever? And I'm like, no. It's just from the trombone thing and blowing that out and having a couple surgeries.
Yeah.
When I tore this for the second time and my jazz career was over, I was already personal training. That was like my waitering job, quote unquote. You know, like artists, like waiters on the side. I was like an artist, but a personal trainer on the side.
Yeah.
So once that all happened, I just let personal training take over. And, you know, I was doing that full time. And then I ended up going to New York sports clubs and had to take their training and development, and was inspired by one of their educators that I wanted to educate. And that's where my education career started, right? It was training trainers for New York sports clubs. Now that was like 20 something years ago, not to date myself, but once I fell in love with education, then I kind of realized, like, I was an educator who didn't really have the degrees to make sure I could keep that job moving forward. So I went back and I got my, you know, I had gotten a fair way through my bachelor's in jazz studies, but I had to kind of start over because of this. went back and got my bachelor's in exercise science, my master's in exercise science. And I think by that time I had already started kind of moving into this direction of like, man, I kind of like the rehab thing. I'd fallen in love with the corrective exercise thing. I actually learned the corrective exercise, NASM's corrective exercise model, before there was a book.
Right.
We actually learned it from Mike Clark because he was trying to kind of experiment with it in the New York Sports Club training and development. I liked the math of it. Obviously, I kind of have an analytical focus, right? Like that's just kind of my thing. So after getting my bachelor's and master's, it didn't take me too long before I went back for my doctorate in physical therapy. Meanwhile, I had gone from New York sports clubs, trained their trainers for several years. Then I went to Equinox, trained their trainers for several years. Then I was with NASM for 6-7 years. And behind the scenes, I'm slowly like building a list of things that I think need to be done better. Mm-hmm. And so sometime early when I had started with NASM, kind of as I was leaving Equinox, I was like, man, I kind of want to start my own thing and see if I can experiment with some of these ideas, which was like the delivery, like teaching anatomy conceptually.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do you create these new lesson plans? And then that kind of all moved as I was coming through NASM. I'm kind of building out this thing of my own ideas. Social media kind of comes in. I realized pretty quickly that this digital thing is going to be kind of big. I got lucky, fell into the membership model early, mm-hmm. right? And slowly as all of this stuff is building, like I'm learning evidence-based practice and yeah, there's a lot going on here. You're asking me to like summarize like 20-something years.
Yeah.
But, yeah, like it kind of like piecemeals together after that, after those big blocks, right? Where it's like, I blow out my chops, I let training take over, I become an educator, I get my degrees, build up these ideas of what I want to do in education, and then launch the Brookbush Institute. And the Brookbush Institute, of course, being a solution, essentially, to what's wrong with education currently, right? Or at least what I thought was wrong with education then. I think we've solved a lot of the problems, but not all of them, obviously. So things like we're the only company that does comprehensive systematic reviews as the base of every course.
Yeah, man. That's
why do we
unique.
do that? Yeah, we do that because evidence base is important, because my opinion isn't. Mm-hmm. I think I'm one of the few quote unquote gurus out there who's like, it's not about me. It never has been, nor has it been about Paul Chek or even Sarman or Yonda or these are all brilliant people who've had some great ideas, but at the end of the day, all that matters is outcomes. Right? We always got to put our brain there. So we start with this comprehensive evidence base, and of course, it's trying to get back to objective data, get away from opinions. And the whole comprehensive piece is so we stop doing some of the stuff that you guys were just talking about, which is like, well, why comprehensive? Because if you're not looking at all the research, you're looking at some of the research. And the last I checked, looking at some of the research is called cherry picking. Right?
Yeah.
That's the evidence-based part. I could get into like the decision theory part of also what we're doing being built on predictive models. And then there's the whole delivery piece, which you guys found early. Yeah. And then of course there's the whole access, affordability, flexibility, convenience piece, which the online education thing is really big for us. And you put all that together, that kind of ends up being the Brookbush Institute. And
there we are. Yeah.
And my love-hate relationship with what I do now.
So you still love it? You still love what you do, and it's like your passion and your dream?
I do. I mean, I get frustrated just like anybody else, and now I'm a CEO, and there's different responsibilities. There's some parts of the job that are not great. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I'm surviving the Great Resignation the last 2 years.
Yeah.
People's attitudes towards work was like, as a boss, was like just taking it in the chin every day. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the thing that I'm starting to wear down on now is like, I don't have the stamina I had. I need to figure out how to not work 7 days a week, putting in 60 to 80 hours a week. Like it just,
Well,
it was
yeah.
one thing when I was in my late 20s, early 30s building, but now I'm kind of like, okay,
Yeah.
at some point this train has to slow down.
Yeah.
It just can't be at this
It
tempo
just
all
has
the
to,
time.
eh?
So is your time mainly spent now just coming up with things, adding to the institute, or searching through the research, or just ideas that you constantly like, oh, that needs to be in there as a video I want to put in there? Is that what your mind is at now?
Where my mind is at, I was like, what my day-to-day looks like? That,
Yeah.
no, I wish. I wish I could just sit back and be creative and be like, okay, you guys do it.
Yeah.
Definitely doesn't work that way. No, I mean, I think one of my strengths as CEO or president or founder or whatever you want to call me, it doesn't really matter, is being able to think in a little larger timelines. So we're working through a strategic plan that is, essentially a 15-year plan. We're in year like 11. The next couple of years are pretty well mapped out. We just went through a couple of really hard years where a lot of what we had to do was rebuild the foundation so that we could scale. We kind of had hit this point where we couldn't get bigger with the amount of organization and foundation that we had. Like just things were just too much a mess.
Yeah.
So we just went through a couple hard years, and now hopefully we're looking forward to a couple years of like, okay, we're going to have some new certifications coming out. We got some exciting new courses coming out. We launched the new website hopefully next month,
Cool.
Which we're really excited about. It's still the Brookbush Institute. We just, the old website hadn't reached what we like to call maximum spaghettification of code.
Yeah.
It got to the point where it was like, it was so convoluted, like you couldn't touch anything without anything breaking.
Wow. Okay.
So, now that we have the new site, we'll be able to get more new features, better mobile experience, like all that fun stuff. So where my brain is now, it's a little bit more complex than just like ideas. It's kind of like going, okay, if we take the idea that we're trying to optimize the quality of our content and the value of our content, and we're trying to optimize the delivery, right? Which is that accessibility, convenience, the ability to study online. And then you have the business piece, which is like the marketing and finance, which, you can say whatever you want. At the end of the day, we would like things to stay really affordable and more affordable for students than they ever have been. Well, that takes some really savvy marketing, and right? Like it's a savvy business planning. So I guess most of my brain is figuring out how to thread that needle, right? Which obviously has a very small eye, right? To make all of that work together. It's challenging.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, man. It's just those hurdles. It's cool. It's cool. But it's just like it basically there's a lot of like upcoming Czech students hit us up, and I just refer to your stuff like, man, go learn that, even to start on YouTube and then dive into it and then sign up, because it's like I said, it empowers you. It gives you such a good foundation to understand that. I think, like, did you find, because you obviously did uni and then you went into and started learning a lot more, how did you find integrating what you were taught in uni into clinical experience? Did you find it helped, or did you have to, like, did you sort of come out feeling a little lost?
That's a great question. Okay. You're hitting on something that I think we gotta set some roadblocks up here a little bit. Okay. So if I was going to hire somebody onto the content development team, they have to have a minimum of a doctorate. Okay. Now, why do I say that? Because only doctors are smart? No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is a doctorate is the only minimum standard that I'm aware of that will ensure somebody has experience handling research, right? The interpretation of research. So when we talk about education, a lot of times what we have to realize is we're not talking about maximum standards. We're talking about minimum standards. What is the lowest threshold that you're comfortable with somebody entering a profession, right? And sometimes these are filtering things. So again, could I find somebody who's good at interpreting research without a doctorate? Sure. But as an employer, if I have to look at hundreds of applications, I can't look at all 100 applications. I need to get it down to the next 20 to 50 people so that I can get it down to a number that I can actually interview, right? So that becomes my filtering. All right. Just wanted to put all that out there because what I'm going to say about education is not going to be good. And I want people to understand that I still think that the best path forward for any career is to get a degree. I think if you're going to stay, where are you guys located?
Queensland, Australia.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not quite sure how things are working out in Australia.
Yeah.
But it seems to me in the United States, the middle class is kind of falling apart. And what remains of the middle class is the college educated.
Right.
Okay. This is the most secure way to stay in the middle class. I'm not saying it's the only way. I'm just saying it's the most secure, highest probability way of staying inside the middle class of this country. Right. So I think uni is still the best way to do that. And I care about people. I want to see them do well. Now, is that the right way? I'm not here to argue that. When I got into university, I can tell you I had some absolutely horrible experiences and a couple of good ones. My good ones came down to the distance learning programs I went to through CalU, which now they just recently changed their name. But it's a similar program to what we partnered with at Concordia University, Chicago. All right, where you basically had a program that was built around something like the Brookbush Institute or maybe NASM, something like that, so that you're getting that combination of a practical cert or practical education that's commonly used in the field with the breadth that comes from a college education. Now, before that, I had some pretty horrible experiences in university. Doesn't take very long to be in university where you realize professors are experts in their field. They're not experts in education.
Yeah.
Most of them can't teach to save their lives. Sorry to be so blunt, but
oh, it's so true.
It's kind of true.
Yeah.
And I had really hoped that when I got to my doctorate in physical therapy, I would finally reach a level where I would find mentors, find people to look up to, find people to really latch onto for additional information. And it ended up being the worst of all of my education experiences.
Wow.
The only thing I can say DPT school did for me is teach me some stuff about history. And the only reason is that happened is because that program was so far behind in decades that they were still teaching history as current knowledge.
Wow.
I actually I had gotten into a pretty heated debate with one of the professors, and I was like, you might as well call this a doctorate in physical therapy history because you guys haven't taught anything that has happened in the last 50 years. There was also a lot of unprofessional conduct, which I think is, and when I say unprofessional conduct, I mean things like biased grading and tests that were written in such a way that you were lucky to get a correct answer.
Yeah.
Just some unprofessional critiques that I just did not appreciate. Definitely some unprofessional behavior when it came to realizing that some of us had to keep jobs, to keep food on the table, to pay our rent, and just not having any empathy.
Yeah.
I think by the time I got through that experience, the interesting thing for me was it was I had already started teaching. I had already started the Brookbush Institute. And at first, I was thinking to myself, I'll make a better certification, right? I'm capable as a human being of doing that, right? I was humble about it. I was like, I can't do anything about the degree program. By the time I got out of physical therapy school, I was like, I'm burning the whole damn thing down. We're fixing this shit, right?
Yeah.
And I think it helped give me the confidence to go, education's bad in general, and it could be a lot better at all levels, right?
Yeah.
So I don't need to tiptoe anymore. I don't need to not talk about putting a master's degree together. I don't need to not talk about putting a certification for manual therapy or certified personal training or corrective exercise. Like, I don't need to just be a CE provider. I don't need to just be a guru on the internet. Like, no. There's stuff that can be fixed. It's possible to be fixed, and I'm going to step into this race and try to do it.
It's awesome, man.
So yeah, that's where I got with education. It's interesting.
Yeah.
DPT school basically taught me, here's the history of physical therapy, and here's how not to kill somebody.
Yeah, right.
Which is important.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
That's not important. Physical therapists, we do see things that like personal trainers don't see.
Yeah.
You know, and I think people forget about that. It's like, it's all fine and good when you're dealing with low back pain in the gym, but like when you're dealing with low back pain in a clinic and it's somebody who has a long history of different medical conditions and you don't know exactly where that low back pain is coming from, it's a different story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I found with your teaching methods, man, I think what you're really good at, just from watching the in live classes, is that you make people not afraid to ask questions. And we've had mentors where they make you afraid to ask questions, so they make you feel stupid for asking a question, right? But yeah, I've just noticed you almost encourage the question. You almost encourage, like, it's all right, just like that. And so people just throw it out there, but it makes you start thinking. And I think that's so powerful to even just, and that's just in the energy in the aura. So there's all these little subtle things, right? Where it could be body language, it could be anything, but that's what communication is, and it comes through in that sense. And I think, yeah, it just really it just helps. It helped me a lot, and I noticed that just from even looking at the people's faces in the class and the mannerisms. They were like, "Oh, should I say it? Yeah, I'll say it." And you're like, "Oh, nah, not that one. But what are the other options?" And made them start thinking. So I think that's just a cool point. I'm not sure if you're aware of it or not, but that's what I took from that.
I think that's one of those points where like I have to remember the difference between the classroom and online. Because I think if you ask my trolls, they swear to God I'm like this arrogant know-it-all who is always right. And it's like, yeah, no, it's just research. Like, you're not seeing my face. And, you know, kind of part of this contrarian ethic is like, if I don't agree with you, you're an asshole, right? Or I'm an asshole. You know, like, it's very weird. It's a very weird thing. Like,
it's weird.
Like the other day, I was on this comment thread that just got way out of hand, and I was like, "Actually, that's not true. Here's the research why." How dare you? It's like,
yeah,
it's just not true, bro.
Yeah,
that's according to your opinion. Nope, this is science. Like I'm not asking you to change anything other than something that already exists. And to your point with the questions, it doesn't take you very long inside of even like a DPT degree. And, you know, I went to a state school. The program wasn't great, but the interesting thing was the tuition was so much cheaper than all of the other schools that it ends up getting to cherry pick the best students that apply in the region, right? Mm-hmm. So I got very lucky to get in, right? Like, it's literally 1/5 the cost of all the other schools in the region.
Wow. Yeah.
So all of the students were super smart. Doesn't take you very long, though, to realize we all had gaps, and like strange gaps. Like, one of us would have had a really weak physics class, right? And then one of us would be relatively weak with anatomy, right? And then another person has never had exercise science as long as they have lived, right? Like, and you go, well, at that point, what's a stupid question? Is it my fault that I came from this class that didn't teach me anything that had to do with the physics of electric stim? It's not my fault. I need to study it. I'm not saying I shouldn't learn it, but like, everybody has questions. Like, functional anatomy isn't a thing everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? When we talk about functional anatomy, we're talking about like, I don't know that many classes that teach like us that are like, what are all the extensors of the hip? That's functional anatomy, right? As opposed to, this is the glute max. Its origin is here. Its insertion is here. Its nerve. And then they go on to the next muscle, right? They never tie it all together.
Yeah.
So somebody comes into the Brookbush Institute, they don't know functional anatomy, they look at the overhead squat and go, oh shit, that's okay. You're going to spend a little extra time learning the overhead squat. You'll get through it, and then everything will be fine, right? But is that person stupid for not knowing it? No. If they came from a program that was based in NSCA, they probably have a really strong exercise physiology background. The whole textbook is seemingly an exercise physiology textbook. But with that being said, I don't think exercise physiology is that practical when it comes to actually being on the floor.
Yeah.
Is that the person who's coming into the Brookbush Institute, is that their fault? Right? That they have all this exercise phys that maybe doesn't apply to everything we do? No. And is it useful at some level? Of course. Like if you get far enough into program design, you are going to run back into exercise physiology. It's just a little deeper along.
Yeah. Fuck, that's cool, man. And I guess segueing into like some cool just concepts that I took from your work and just ways of thinking is like seeing muscles that are, say if you see a muscle that you stretch and it just tightens back up again, and you stretch and it tightens back up again. And when you see that, are you starting to think, okay, well, is this muscle being synergistically dominant, or is this setting off at least a spark in your brain being synergistically dominant for its partner? Or is that the way you start thinking about things? Like say it's tight and then you look at the insertion origin and it's sort of within its norms. Like, you get someone that has anterior tilt always complains about their tight hamstrings, which is like a go-to, right? But then you stretch the hamstrings, they stretch their hamstrings, and then it is always going to tighten back up. So do you see a muscle that when they stretch it tightens back up as either being synergistically dominant or reciprocally inhibited? Or would the assessment just come from that?
Oh, man. A can of worms you just opened
up.
No,
I love it.
So I never look at one muscle as anything, right?
Okay, yeah.
You're looking at patterns. So this gets into that modeling piece, which I started to allude to earlier. So being evidence-based is part of it. But then we have to get into this thing of like decision theory. And this is a whole science unto itself. Sorting theory, labeling theory, right? Like you can think in terms of game theory, even at a certain level applies to this. If you're going to be like outcome driven and try to go backwards from your outcome. So first things first. If we were going to start with one muscle, maybe the next question I would ask you would be, what are the categories I'm allowed to label this muscle as? Right? So have you even thought about how many ways you could label a muscle? Because you just said synergistically dominant versus reciprocally inhibited.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, where does overactive and underactive come in? Where does short and long come in? What about the terms tonic and phasic? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Are some of those synonyms, or are these all separate categories?
Yeah. Synergistically dominant, tonic. Yeah, you just go all day, right?
Yeah. That thing.
Yeah.
So this is what, obviously where my mind has progressed. And it's taken a long time, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing we would do with this muscle is we would go, how many categories are there? Okay, now if you're talking about Brookbush Institute, there's 4 categories. Okay, you have 2 different lengths something can be, and 2 different activities something can be. And when you combine 2 of one thing and 2 of another, you end up with 4 possibilities, right? It's 2 squared is how many potential combinations you can end up with.
Mm-hmm.
So you have short overactive, short underactive, long overactive, long underactive, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we got really technical, and this is an article that's going to be coming out in the future, we should probably actually change those terms to something more like category 1, 2, 3, and 4, because what we're actually referring to with those labels of overactive short, overactive long, is what would be the appropriate techniques to use on this muscle based on its label. Unfortunately, that's a tautology. If you don't know what a tautology is circular logic. So if you label something as short overactive, that implies that you should release and stretch it. And because it did a little better with release and stretching, you assume that short and overactive is the right label. You've created a logic loop, but you don't have other information coming in, so you don't have a way to double check yourself. Okay. So now we take this one muscle, we have 4 categories. We realize we have a tautology in the way we categorize things now, because all of those labels do is imply what techniques we should use on that muscle. Then the question comes down to, how do we identify which category the muscle falls in? Because even to your point, you've kind of described an overactive muscle, but you haven't really delineated whether it's short or long. That's a problem, right?
Yeah.
So what other assessment would we use, right? And then you mentioned the overhead squat assessment. Okay, that's cool. And then you go, well, what is the overhead squat assessment? And the overhead squat assessment is basically actually just a group of 8 or 9 signs that we know can be reliably identified. But that's not enough, because we have to be able to not only reliably identify that sign, it has to be effective in differentiating between the categories that we've described, so that we can then match the most appropriate techniques to that label to ensure that we have best possible outcomes. What? Right? So all of this is to say that modeling becomes important, right? And this is where you see predictive models of lower extremity dysfunction, upper body dysfunction, lumbopubic hip complex dysfunction, lumbosacral dysfunction. Those are up on the site, right? You've seen those courses from me. The reason why those models exist is to start handling this problem that we're describing. Because there's many interdependencies along this chain, we have to step back and go, wait a second, I can't just look at one muscle anymore. Right? And there's other really intractable problems within this, like people who in rehab who try to base interventions on symptoms. I have low back pain, so I should do press-ups. That doesn't work very well. That's like saying I have a sore throat, so I took a throat lozenge, and then you come to find out you have strep throat and almost died, right? Like, you needed antibiotics. You didn't take the assessment far enough, right? You didn't find out whether or not that sore throat was coming from postnasal drip and an allergy or a bacterial infection. So, yeah, you get into this modeling thing, and I think to answer your question, one nice thing these models imply is that muscles almost always fall in the same category. Muscles don't switch categories. So your biceps femoris is going to be long overactive forever. If your biceps femoris changed in activity and length, it's going to be long overactive. What do we do to long overactive muscles? Well, we don't want to stretch them because they're long, but if they're overactive, we want to release them. So something like foam rolling works really well. Well, in the case of the biceps femoris, foam rolling doesn't work really well, but if you use a tennis ball at the end of a chair or a tennis ball at the end of a plyo box, that works really well.
Yeah.
But you kind of get where I'm saying, where it's like, okay, wow, that was a lot. But in the end, the nice thing is these models predict patterns. And once you memorize the patterns, you actually have less information to know, not more. Like, I can look at somebody who has feet turn out or feet flatten or knee valgus, and I know what I'm going to do. And yes, it sounds complicated at first. What are you going to do, Brent? Dr. Brookbush, if somebody's being really, really formal, right? Like, I'm going to release TFL, vastus lateralis, biceps femoris. Those are my tibial external rotators. I might release the fibularis muscles, soleus, gastroc. All right, good. What might I mobilize? Mobilizations, hip mobilization, knee mobilization, proximal and distal tib fib mobilization. Look at the ankle and look at the foot. Boom. All right, done with that. Good. What are you going to stretch? Well, I might stretch the hip flexors. Might stretch the ankle, right? Probably don't need to stretch the knee, not a joint that generally needs to be stretched. And then what am I going to activate? Glute medius, glute maximus, right? Like tibialis anterior, tibialis posterior, those inverters.
Mm-hmm.
And then what are my integrated exercises? Something like a single leg touchdown, single leg balance if I'm dealing with somebody who's not quite as active, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe I can do something really fancy like single leg touchdown with posterior pull to curl to press, right? Like get really, really fancy with them. That sounds like a lot when you first tell that to a new student. But the cool thing is progressions and regressions of those things will change, but the list doesn't. Right? So now I've memorized a list. I have a finite number of these lists that I need to memorize, and I can be a freaking monster clinician or a monster corrective exercise professional or a monster fitness professional. The equation, super complicated. As we were just talking about, we're dealing with the freaking human body.
Yeah.
Most complicated machine ever, right? But at the end of the day, there's usually a simple solution.
Yeah.
Usually.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of your biceps femoris, the other thing I would bring up too is I would never just treat the biceps femoris, because if you don't deal with the underlying issue, of course it's just going to keep tightening up, right? Like it's like you fixed one part of a broken hole.
Yeah.
What's going to happen?
Yeah. That's so true. That's so cool. It was funny. The last podcast we had with Walden, he was talking about a case study where this person's hamstring strain was going all the time and on the table, couldn't get it past whatever it was, 120 degrees or something. And then put some, form closure into the back of the pelvis where the multifidus wasn't working. And straight away the hamstring released on the table, like on the spot, and broke down like that even, you know what I mean? So there's so many little factors. And I guess that's where you're assessing, because you know so many assessment techniques where then you, with experience, you can start to play with that. Because when you say the feet turn out thing, will you go confirm with goniometry and then start playing from there?
Okay, so let's talk about assessments here real quick. I actually don't know that many assessments. I mean, I guess I've learned a lot of assessments, but I don't use that many assessments because I only, we have to get past this idea that like every assessment is good. Mm-hmm. An assessment is only good if it does one of two things. It alerts you to a potentially hazardous instance or something that maybe you shouldn't be addressing. Maybe this happens with like certain special tests where if I'm dealing with cervical instability and I find somebody that's a positive, I probably need to refer them out to a physician. They probably shouldn't get physical therapy right off the bat. Mm-hmm. Right? That's one small set of special tests. We'll call those clearance exams. When it comes to movement assessment, which is what we're mostly talking about here, the only assessments I ever want to use are the ones that are going to change my intervention plan. Remember what we were talking about before with the decision theory. Mm-hmm. The only assessments I need are the ones that help me categorize what category the muscle falls into or what category the joint falls into. For example, if we're talking about joints, is it normal range, stiff, or hypermobile? So I only need assessments that do these things. Mm. Now, goniometry is a little different. When we teach goniometry, what we're teaching is a continuous interval measure. You have discrete measures versus continuous interval measures. In the case of the overhead squat assessment, you have something that's a discrete or binary assessment, right? What does that mean? Well, that means you either have feet turn out or you don't. There is no way to mark improvement on an overhead squat assessment. Mm-hmm. I mean, unless you literally fix it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Right? If you improve, feet turn out. I'm not saying you didn't do anything. Obviously, you did something, and that might make somebody feel better or perform better, right? But there's no way to mark that on the overhead squat assessment. So what do I know is tied to feet turn out? And some of this you have to use some research as well. You have to use the predictive models to get there. But things that are affiliated with feet turnout might be changes in ankle mobility and changes in hip mobility. So I'm going to pull out my goniometer and I'm going to see what is my ankle mobility and what is my hip mobility. Now, goniometry, you have degrees, right? It's not yes or no. It's 7 or 12 or 11 or 5 or whatever, right? If my feet turnout got a little better, but my dorsiflexion, which I know is tied to feet turnout, goes from 3 degrees, which sucks, to 9 degrees, right? Even if I didn't get them to turn all the way back in, the fact that I know that I went from 3 degrees to 9 degrees and more than 5 degrees on a goniometer is a reliable measure. We know this, right? For large joint motions. Right? 3 degrees to 9 degrees.
Yeah.
I know I've made improvement. It's not 15 to 20, which is optimal, but at least I know I got something back. So that's where goniometry comes in. Generally speaking, goniometry doesn't give me more information. Truthfully, I could treat most things just with the overhead squat assessment alone, right? That gives me enough intervention to delineate which pattern I need to address. But goniometry does become helpful so that I know how much improvement I made if I don't knock it out of the park on session 1 and get them all the way back to perfect on the money.
When you say overhead squat assessment, what does that look like for the listeners out there? Like overhead squat as in like a squat with just pushing something overhead?
No, so the overhead squat assessment is an assessment.
Yeah.
It is a particular assessment, right? So you're doing a squat. Now, I won't tell my patients or clients they're a squat.
Yep.
Right? I'll just say, look, we're going to do some sit to stand things. No chair. You're going to pretend to sit down and stand up. An overhead squat assessment is feet parallel and hip width. All right? So second toe underneath the ASIs. Well, I don't squat that way in the gym. I don't care. All right? This is an assessment.
Yeah.
All right? This is where that's two different arguments, right? So second toe underneath ASIS, second toe is parallel to one another, and then we're going to put our hands up over our head like this, and we're going to sit down and stand up. And there's, I think, 8 or 9 signs, right, that I am looking for from a front, side, and posterior view. Those are the reliable signs, right? And then what I might do, and probably will do, is then we'll do a squat with modification, an overhead squat assessment with modification, which is heel rise and hands down, and that helps us differentiate the lumbopelvic hip complex from lower extremity or lumbopelvic hip complex from the upper extremity. But we have those courses, obviously. You can get a ton of information from that assessment when you use it the way we talk about. So it's not just like a good or bad thing. It would be like, does somebody have feet flattened, feet turn out, knees bow in, knees bow out? Right? Do they have an anterior pelvic tilt, excessive forward lean, arms fall, asymmetrical weight shift, right? Like those are the signs.
Yeah.
So I go through and I see if those signs are there or not. Everybody has at least one of those signs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. What's so, and say you see, let's say an anterior tilt, then do you refer, like for you to then figure out, okay, is there things tight that's restricting this, or is this just a complete weakness somewhere? And do you just go into further assessment from that?
No. The answer to your question is yes to both.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as one weakness or one tightness. You have an anterior pelvic tilt. So then we would go into an analysis of an anterior pelvic tilt. What's an anterior pelvic tilt? Well, an anterior pelvic tilt is excessive lumbar extension and excessive hip flexion. So what can we probably assess from that? Well, we can then go into, it's probably going to be short lumbar extensors, short hip flexors. We can take this another step further. If my hip flexors are short, then what's probably going on with my hip extensors? They're probably long, right? And if my lumbar extensors are short, then what's going on with my lumbar flexors? They're probably long.
Yeah.
Right? So lumbar extensors are short, lumbar flexors are long. All right, good. We set up this analysis. Okay. And then this is where the modeling comes in. This is where research comes in, right? Because we know that that's not quite enough. We know that if my glutes, right, this is where reciprocal inhibition, synergistic dominance, these terms come in. We said hip flexors are short, hip extensors are long. And we go, well, so we think, Does that mean all of our hip flexors are going to be short? No, we know that certain things have more of a propensity to get short. I would put probably TFL at the top of the list for hip flexors, and then maybe rectus femoris, and probably psoas would be dead last, although it gets buoyant. Right? But you got your TFL. Well, what happens to my glute max? Well, my glute max gets reciprocally inhibited, so it becomes long and underactive. But then we get this crazy thing. Well, what happens to the hamstrings? They get long and underactive? Ooh, no. Now we have synergistic dominance, because what ends up happening in the human body, strangely, is certain muscles will go, this isn't perfect, I'm out. Right? And those are the long, underactive muscles. And then we need somebody to take up the slack, which in the case of our glute max becomes the hamstrings for hip extension. They become synergistic dominant. Synergistically dominant muscles most often are long, overactive. Wow, right? So we started off with the short, long thing, and then we're kind of back to the conversation we were having before of how many categories do muscles fall into, right? Well, now we have to add the overactive, underactive piece. Mm-hmm. And then with research and kind of the stuff that we've just been talking about, which sometimes is clinical outcomes, that's where we get into these more sophisticated models, like you see with our lumbopelvic hip complex dysfunction model, where we're trying to help out by going, okay, look, guys, I understand that I said that the hip extensors are long, but the research shows that the biceps femoris cranks up in activity. The adductor magnus cranks up in activity. In fact, we can also add the deep rotators of the hip generally crank up in overactivity, right? Even if somebody has knee valgus, their knees bow in, yeah, it still goes up in activity, but those muscles are actually long, right? Because they've been turned long, right? Yeah. So...
True, yeah. So it opens up a way of thinking. Like, I just think, okay, say you got the, say you're trying to strengthen someone's glutes, but they got synergistically dominant hamstrings, and say you're giving them like a reverse hyperextension, but not going high enough that's going to compress their short and overactive lumbar extensors. I hope I'm making sense at the moment. So then you could bend their knee to take the hamstring out of it and just use the glutes for the reverse hyperextension, or that would be a non-optimal choice, because then you're using the lumbar extensors with it for their anterior tilt.
Oh man, you're starting to put it all together.
Yeah,
just hand the company over. Let's go. You take it over, man. Yeah. So it's interesting, because for the example that you're talking about, you're kind of talking about like, we have the Brookbush Institute definition of activation techniques, right? So activation techniques are techniques intended for a muscle that's been assessed as underactive, with additional cues to try to reciprocally inhibit overactive synergists, right? That's the definition of a Brookbush Institute technique. Now, that was me taking something I learned from Mike Clark. He had shown us a gluteus medius activation, and he showed us how if you do gluteus medius side-lying leg raises against a wall and press your heel against the wall so that you're adding extension to adduction, you reciprocally inhibit the TFL. And I went, why not do that with all the activation techniques? Right? And you end up having to come up with these like clever little ways of getting things out. So with the glute max, your big problems are your lumbar erectors, your adductor magnus, and your biceps femoris. Well, you can kind of get biceps femoris out by squeezing your quad, right? Using your quads to reciprocally inhibit your hamstrings. Or you can do what you do and create something called passive insufficiency by flexing the leg enough that they're in such a shortened position, the hamstrings, that they don't want to fire, right? How do you get out adductor magnus? You add a little abduction. How do you get out of using the lumbar erectors? You make somebody basically contract their abdominal wall, right? So then that ends up, I just literally described the glute max activation that's on our site.
Yeah, right? That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Fuck, it's exciting, isn't it? It's exciting just to start thinking like that, man. I really enjoy it.
Hey, it's conceptual.
It's concepts, and it excites the shit out of me. It makes it
exciting.
Yeah. Man, and I just got to ask you one question, and it's pure. I've wanted to ask you this because I feel like the only person I can ask, and it's got nothing. It's just a full client question. But when you get people with the overactive, like this is common in jiu-jitsu, and we both do jiu-jitsu, right? Where posterior delt gets so I guess tight that it starts to get a dull ache, and I'm just I get so curious. I've tried so many things. Like why is the posterior delt becoming so hyperactive, even when I'm doing sort of external rotator work and things like that? Have you seen that in your? Sorry. Yeah.
In fact, I'm dealing with some stuff kind of similar to that right now. I'm a basketball player, right?
Right.
Sick.
Trying to stay out on the court in my 40s is not.
You look good, man. You look like you're in 30s.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll take it. I was on the basketball court yesterday. I feel 80. Anyway, right? So posterior delt is your overactive synergist of your shoulder. It is the biceps femoris of your shoulder.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So the weird thing with the shoulder is you have to be careful because people have this tendency to get hypermobile. So the first thing I would check with you guys, especially being jiu-jitsu, is actually, do you have excessive external rotation?
Right.
Right. If you have excessive shoulder external rotation and plenty of shoulder flexion, I might be like, yo, if you're stretching your shoulders, you need to relax. Mm-hmm. Right. And then the next thing we would probably look at is your shoulder is one joint. Right. But it's attached to a system. You know, what does your scapular movement look like? What does your thoracic and lower cervical movement look like? Mm-hmm. Right. So that cervical thoracic junction, scapula and shoulder, that becomes the model that is upper body dysfunction, and can we address that? And if you keep releasing your posterior delt and it keeps coming back, you have the same problem you did with your biceps femoris example, right? You're trying to treat your biceps femoris. You need to be treating lower extremity dysfunction or lumbopelvic hip complex dysfunction, not your biceps femoris. Your biceps femoris is just one piece. So like I've been having some posterior delt pain. As you guys know, I mean, basketball's an overhead sport, right? You don't get put in weird positions, but you are constantly up overhead.
For sure.
Well, is it my shoulder that I need to address? Maybe, but there's as much chance it's coming from my CT junction, right? Which, you know, you think about things that attach to your cervical thoracic junction, your levator scapulae, your upper trapezius, two large anterior tippers of your scapula. And if my scapula is anteriorly tipped, is my shoulder going to be in a good spot? Nope.
Yeah. Man, I actually never realized that the upper trap anteriorly tips the scapula. I never knew that.
Most people don't. Anatomy classes don't teach anterior tipping.
Yeah.
There are so many things. If I made a list, and every once in a while I want to do this just for my own ego, all the things that I've brought to the forefront that just aren't in things.
Yeah.
I'm not even saying like I invented them. Don't take it the wrong way. I'm not saying I invented anterior tipping. That's not what I'm saying. Right? Like, but like they don't teach anterior tipping in most anatomy programs, and then you realize like anterior tipping is a primary component of the upper body dysfunction model, right? It's part of the scapular dyskinesis. The only person I've ever seen mention anterior tipping outside of the Brookbush Institute is this study that we cite actually in our research that used bone pins to show scapular motion in people with shoulder impingement syndrome. This guy named Lawrence. And he actually refers to excessive downward rotation and anterior tipping. But yeah, man.
Yeah.
Dude, if it's your upper trap, I'll
try to put
lose
it all
it.
together is a lot.
I've recently, do you know Diane Lee?
I know Diane Lee. I don't really know her stuff.
Okay, she's got the book,
all I read is research at this point.
The pelvic girdle and the thorax. I'm recently finishing a mentorship with. She's from Canada, but she's flying to Sydney a few times a year, and she recently just told us in anatomy there's fibers, and she goes pretty well. Most anatomy books don't have this, and the apps don't have this, but it's in a couple of books that there's upper fibers of the serratus anterior can actually cause an anterior tipping effect. And then there was someone in the class, and then she got in there. It wasn't levator scap. She sort of got in there, and she goes, it's not showing in most textbooks, but there's this little part, and we saw this guy's shoulder got tipped back, posteriorly tipped back a little bit after a little release. So there's this cool things you constantly get from little people that bring it all together. Because I only ever thought of pec minor as anteriorly tipping it, or
Yeah, me too.
Or what else? What else?
Pec minor is a big anterior tipper. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I see that because I've seen like watch someone scap, stretch the pec minor, and then you watch it go flusher. You know, without the lower trapezius or the serratus work.
Makes sense with the upper trap too, eh?
Yeah, well, because I guess, and would it be if the head's more forward, would it more anteriorly tip compared to someone with a tight upper trap but a more of a neutral? Well, wouldn't it?
So forward head posture is the cervical dysfunction model, right? Like
Right.
we have to get into what forward head posture is, but like
Yeah, man.
it's funny because these patterns, as we were talking about, this stuff sounds all complicated, and at some level it obviously is. I'm not, for those students who are out there being like, dude, I'm having a hard time following this conversation. Don't worry about it. You'll get it in like a year.
Yeah.
The crazy thing is like these patterns are like nearly ubiquitous. Like they're always the same. We don't see a retracted. We don't see backward head posture.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like you don't see, feet flatten. For the most part, there's no such thing as an excessive supinator. Right? Like if you see somebody's feet do this during a squat, like the only time you ever see that is a neurological disorder.
Right.
You can see that in orthopedic disorders. Right? So like you just see these things like it's the same over and over and over and over again. Posterior pelvic tilts are super, super uncommon. We see anterior pelvic tilts all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you see it and I remember hearing you state, and this is what cool from the clinical experience, is like you'll see posterior pelvic tilt in a lot of disc injuries, and like they'll come in and it'll literally be inverted. And I remember hearing you talk about like that's generally them just lacking stability. So they're using, I guess, a ligamental tension way of stabilizing the segments. Is that what you were thinking?
So you just keep dissecting layers, right? So with most lumbar issues, you don't have hypermobility or hypomobility. You don't have a stability issue or a stiffness issue. You have a combination. You have to remember that like between, L1 or T12, if we want to go that high, and your sacrum, you have multiple segments. And the research shows that what you'll end up with is hypermobility at like L5S1, maybe L4, L5, and then excessive stiffness L2 through L3, L4, right? And then maybe some hypermobility again at the lumbothoracic junction or the thoracolumbar junction, whatever you want to call it, right? So you keep dissecting this stuff and you go, oh, so that's why press-ups don't always work.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if press-ups are making your L5S1 instability worse, it's going to make things worse. If they happen to increase motion at stiff L2 to L4 segments, assuming that that's what's presenting in this patient, then it'll get better. Right? So
that's where the overhead squat assessment comes into play, and you start to see what segments aren't mobilizing.
Well, yeah, so that gets a little interesting because then we get into something called a passive accessory motion exam, which, reliability of that has been called into question. But when you stack passive accessory motions exam, which is like manual, is this stiff or not? Like doing a mobilization on it. When you combine that with other things like, is this person restricted with lumbar rotation? Are they stiff with lumbar rotation? Are they asymmetrical with lumbar rotation? Right? On top of maybe seeing what pattern they present with during the overhead squat assessment. That's kind of where you end up figuring this stuff out step by step.
Yeah, man.
It's just the decision tree. Right?
Yeah, man.
You know who had a decision tree, honestly, who was way on top of this? And I think his decision tree just got maybe a little out of hand, but that doesn't mean anything, right? Like, I should state now, there are brilliant people who had it wrong, but got us the biggest first step, right?
Yeah.
So every once in a while, I'll hear somebody like remark that like Yanda's upper cross syndrome is bullshit. No. Thanks to Yanda, I can actually sit here and talk to you about modeling. Yanda's the first person to ever discuss anything that even looked like a model. I don't care how wrong his models are. He is literally Darwin to everything I'm talking about, right? Like if Darwin was the theory of evolution and evolutionary biology that came after it proves everything he said wrong, he's still the started of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So, you can be somewhat wrong and still be really, really, really right. I think the person who probably started down the decision tree path, right, is you have Mike Clark coming up with a systematic approach, and you have Gray Cook with the SFMA. I think in the case of the SFMA, it just got a little out of hand. Like it had too many branches, you know, but like it's definitely the right idea.
Yeah.
Important some your history, man.
Yeah. No, it's inspired me to like, just keep looking into all that stuff and seeing which direction I'll start heading in. Man, love the chat. It was huge for us because again, we watched so much of your stuff, and for anyone listening, like we got. Not everyone that listens to this podcast is all into the body. It's just a real general thing, but there's a lot of people that are up and coming checks. We have a lot of physios that listen to it. Just that field, but we highly encourage brookbushinstitute.com. It was, I feel like that's your legacy in this world, man. Like teaching that to the mass. I'm not going to say what your legacy is, you know, but that's what it is from my point of view.
Yeah.
That you get people that are just.
It's my life's work. That's
yeah.
The whole thing has been.
Well, we can see it come through you.
Yeah, you're just passionate when you're teaching, man. Like, yeah.
It's like you're being spoken through almost, you know? It's just like, it's not scripted. It's come through really natural, and it really has helped us. And a lot of people listen to us for advice, and we just send them to your website for just clearing all that shit up. And it really, especially for the people, we get sort of physios. I'm not sure, it's different here in Australia than it is over there, right? Completely, all the modalities are somewhat different. Over here, it's very much dry needling, not as much exercise base. It's getting a lot more hands-on, right? Without bringing in exercise. And I think we've had people come message us say they just lack of confidence once they've left uni because they don't really know where to start. They don't really know how to assess pain, and that's the clinician sort of side of things. And I think just your work is so much in there, and man, and it would have taken you so long. You know, I respect it because I see it. I'm like, fuck, that's a lot of work. You know, So that's why it's so respectable.
It is.
Yeah. So again, people listening, and your Instagram is cool, and I love about that you put in quizzes because it makes people think. You know, the quizzes are a cool thing. I like that. Not a lot of people do that.
You know where those quizzes come from, right?
Where?
The quizzes are from the practice exams on our courses.
Oh, right. Yeah. There you go. Just a little screenshot.
So if you're passing those practice exams, you probably can get some credits on the website pretty easy. So
sick.
It's a good idea. It makes people comment. Good for the algorithm, you know?
Yeah.
You follow Brookbush Institute on Instagram. Definitely check out the website. And even for the overhead squat assessment, that's all on YouTube. So you can have a taste of his stuff. There's a lot on YouTube, actually. You can get a taste of it, and it's like, oh, I'm ready to go deeper now. Let's have a look. And that's what we did. I went through every video you have on YouTube, and then I was like, all right, I'm getting an understanding of this. And then we signed in. I was like, man, this is fucking gold. Like, and just especially for the little details in goniometry that some people may be missing. You know, I think it's a lot in there that will really help, especially for the check stuff, because there's so much goniometry that they may forget after their courses, and they can refer to yours. So I think it goes really hand in hand. And man, we really appreciate you coming on, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of reels out of this, and it'll be really cool to get you out here in Australia more, and it'll be sick. So again, we appreciate it.
I've actually been to Australia once. I was actually there when I was like 18, and I was still a jazz musician. I did a jazz tour out there.
Sick.
Nice.
That was pretty cool. I went to Melbourne and Adelaide.
Oh yeah.
I remember.
Yeah, I've never even been to Adelaide.
Yeah, Adelaide's cool. Yeah, but Melbourne's the best. Melbourne's sick.
Melbourne's the city. Yeah. Appreciate it, man.
I remember I got made fun of because I found a white kangaroo, which they were just making fun of me for finding a kangaroo as pale as I am, and I was like, you guys.
I've never even seen that. Hey.
Yeah, they get real pale, eh?
Right, cool. Yeah,
albino kangaroos. It was some reserve. Like, it was just some reserve. I have a picture somewhere.
That's sick.
Of course, I would find the one nearly translucent kangaroo. Thanks, guys. That's great.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, man.
That's going to be my new nickname on social media.
White kangaroo.
Yeah, white kangaroo. That's
a sick name.
That's a good band name. Yeah. All right. Cheers, mate. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Sure,
see you next time, man.
Yeah, legend. Thanks,
Absolutely.
mate.
You.